I once read that being king meant absolute power, but in medieval Europe, it mostly meant being blamed for everything, without owning half the land you were supposedly ruling. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight, you'll meet the unlucky monarchs who wore too many crowns and ruled over chaos instead of kingdoms. It's less Game of Thrones, more Monopoly board with missing pieces, a scepter in one hand, a scroll of unpaid debts in the other. A dozen titles stitched into one robe, but not a single corner of the realm you could visit without risking revolt. Why did kings accept such a headache? What did their crowns even mean? And how did these wobbly empires stay glued together for more than a week? If history's slow, tumble into absurdity soothes you more than modern headlines, you're in the right place. Gently click that like button. Maybe even subscribe like a sleepy vassal, pledging loyalty to your favorite whispering warlord. And if you're listening from a castle cottage or halfway across a sleepless ocean, what time is it there, and who's your favorite questionable royal? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in a drafty hall, chilled stone beneath your feet, surrounded by maps inked with borders that lie. You're king, technically, but it doesn't feel like it. The crown presses heavy on your brow, though not nearly as heavy as the expectations of 100 squabbling lords. In the medieval period, especially in tangled polities like the Holy Roman Empire or the patchwork kingdoms of France and England, being king was often more symbolic than sovereign. You might inherit the title of King of Bohemia, Count of Flanders, Duke of Saxony, and Archduke of something or other, all in one go. But did your horse even know how to get there? Probably not. Some kings never set foot in half the lands they were supposed to govern. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom you've never visited. Your word carries only as far as your most loyal messenger, and even then it risks being ignored, revised, or outright laughed at by local nobles who've been playing lord and liege longer than you've been alive. And while the king was supposed to be the glue, medieval politics didn't care much for neatness. Barons had their own armies, bishops wielded divine influence, and distant provinces often acted like entirely separate nations. It was like being CEO of a company where each department head speaks a different language and also has a sword. Some historians argue this fracturing was the natural outcome of feudalism, with its endless chains of vassalage and mutual obligation. Others suggest it was more intentional, a way for local elites to keep royal power in check, a medieval balancing act, where the king ruled by consent more than decree. Then again, surviving records from these royal courts vary wildly. In some, the king appears omnipotent, surrounded by trembling nobles. In others, he's practically a guest in his own realm, bargaining for influence like a medieval door-to-door salesman. But one thing is certain, the crown did not make the man. It barely gave him a map. The torches flicker as you make your way down a winding stair, the scent of damp stone, giving way to something far less noble. You're not descending into a treasury or war room, but the royal garderobe. Welcome to the place where even a king can't escape the call of nature. If you imagine kings doing their business on golden thrones in rooms perfumed with lavender, think again. Medieval royal toilets called garderobes were essentially wooden benches with a hole perched above open shafts that dropped down the side of the castle wall. Below, waste collected in cesspits or trickled into the surrounding moat. It was less royal flush, more hope it rains soon. And while the stone walls of your castle might keep out invaders, they did nothing to shield against the cold. In winter, using the toilet could feel like a siege on your own backside. Drafts whipped up through the chute. Sitting became a test of bravery. One English chronicler noted a king who delayed his need till pain overtook him, likely because freezing his throne wasn't on the agenda. Now, picture the poor soul known as the gong farmer, tasked with cleaning those royal pits. These laborers often worked at night, hauling waste by the bucket load. It was dangerous work. Fumes from the pits could suffocate. More than one unlucky servant passed out mid-scoop and never woke up again. Despite the stink, gong farmers were well paid and oddly respected. After all, no one else wanted the job. One particularly infamous story tells of King Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, who allegedly fell through a garderobe chute to his death. Was it murder, an accident? A prank gone wrong? Chroniclers offer no consensus. Some suggest enemies tampered with the wooden supports. Others hint he slipped while drunk. The truth remains in the murky depths quite literally. What's clear, though, is that the medieval toilet wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a vulnerability. Castles often placed garderobes along outer walls, which doubled as weak points during sieges. In some rare cases, invading troops crawled up through waste chutes to bypass defenses. Imagine breaching a castle through the royal latrine, less heroic than storming the gate, but undeniably creative. Hygiene minimal, odor maximal. Some garderobes included herbs like lavender or mint in wall niches, not for luxury, but to mask the stench. And the flushing system rainwater at best. Most kings relied on gravity and time. Baths were infrequent, and hand-washing before meals wasn't the norm. Even monarchs smelled human. Architectural historians debate whether garderobe placement reflected a deeper hierarchy. Some suggest higher-ranking nobles had toilets further from their quarters to keep smells at bay. Others argue proximity meant power, the ability to relieve oneself without crossing half the keep. But no matter the layout, the royal garderobe reminds us that even the most exalted ruler had to squat, shiver, and pray for a breeze in the right direction. Because when nature calls in a stone castle, it doesn't care if you're wearing a crown. You tighten the straps on your armor, still warm from the forge, and glance toward the horizon. Another dawn, another battle. There's no time for tea, no morning scrolls by the hearth. Being a king in medieval Europe means you're always at war, whether you want to be or not. From the moment a crown touched your head, it became a helmet by default. Monarchs were expected to lead, not legislate from afar. Young kings barely into adolescence were marched onto fields soaked in dew and danger. At 15, Edward III of England commanded troops. Louis IX of France rode off on a crusade before he could grow a decent beard. In many courts, swordplay preceded literacy. War wasn't just a duty, it was a political necessity. Without military might, your rule looked weak. And in a world built on feudal obligations, if you didn't show up on the battlefield, your vassals might stop showing up at all. A royal absence was an open invitation for rebellion. The Crusades in particular turned Europe into a rotating door of kings on borrowed horses. Some did it for piety, others for prestige, and a few because staying home meant facing an angry court. Richard the Lionheart spent more time campaigning in the Holy Land than ruling England. When he returned, he found his brother trying to claim the throne and his treasury nearly empty. War took a toll not only on the body, but also on the bureaucracy. Castles were left vulnerable, taxes had to be raised, and regions often fell into disarray. And still a king who avoided war was seen as suspect. Peace was for poets and clerics, not rulers. Some scholars argue that medieval kingship was built on a warrior ideal that made diplomacy look like cowardice. Of course, not all kings were eager swordsmen. Charles VI of France reportedly believed he was made of glass and could shatter if touched. Others delegated battles to loyal commanders while they stayed behind with astrologers and jesters. But even these monarchs couldn't avoid the stigma of perceived cowardice. To rule was to risk your neck and hope it stayed attached. One lesser-known campaign involved a teenage king leading a winter assault across frozen marshes, only to have half his troops sink through the ice. Chroniclers differ on whether it was poor planning or divine punishment. Either way, the king returned humiliated and frostbitten. His crown may have still glittered, but his authority had thawed. There were no retirement plans, no medals of valor. If you survived one war, another waited. Some monarchs died before reaching their own cities again. Horses outlived them, ballads forgot them. Even their swords once kissed by priests were melted down for more useful tools. And yet, history praises these warrior kings with bronze statues and dusty hymns. Why? Perhaps because a peaceful ruler leaves fewer dramatic stories. Or maybe we just like our bedtime kings a little bruised and battle-worn. After all, nothing says leadership like a broken nose and a list of enemies longer than your scroll of laws. You eye your plate with suspicion. Roasted pheasant, honeyed carrots, wine aged in a dusty cellar. It looks splendid, but as a medieval king, you've learned the hard way beauty can be deceiving, especially when it comes with silver cutlery and nervous glances from your kitchen staff. Poison was the quiet assassin of royal courts. You didn't need an army to end a reign, just a tainted fig, a drop of arsenic in the wine, or the wrong mushrooms sautéed in garlic. And so, every royal feast came with rituals more complex than a coronation. First came the food tasters, often trusted knights, or long-suffering servants. They took the first bite, then waited. If they keeled over, dinner was canceled. Some monarchs added spit watchers to the lineup, men who stared intently at the tasters' mouths, checking for dry lips, slack jaws, or sudden sweats. It wasn't foolproof. Fast-acting poisons made it obvious. Slow ones, not so much. If your taster looked fine, you might still fall ill days later, wondering if it was last Tuesday's trout or this morning's milk. Paranoia ran deep. Dishes were often served under lock and key, and some kings refused to eat anything they hadn't seen cooked. Others traveled with their own chefs, locked chests of spices, and personalized silverware. In one particularly peculiar case, a ruler banned apples at court, entirely not for allergy, but because a rival's uncle once choked on one. Safer not to tempt fate. Superstition and science blurred at the medieval table. Kings believed that silver utensils would tarnish in the presence of poison. Goblets were sometimes lined with unicorn horn, really narwhal tusk, thought to neutralize toxins. One court alchemist insisted on boiling all drinking water, infusing it with saffron to ward off treachery. No one liked the taste, but they drank it anyway. The fear wasn't unfounded. Royal assassinations via poison weren't common, but they happened just often enough to keep everyone nervous. Some scholars debate how many deaths were truly poisonings and how many were misdiagnosed stomach ailments. Medieval doctors, after all, couldn't tell the difference between arsenic and indigestion. If a king groaned and turned green, they blamed sorcery. Or spicy stew. The kitchen became a zone of both luxury and dread. Castles might employ dozens of cooks, brewers, and bakers all under watch. Servants were rotated to prevent bribery. Some kitchens had hidden observation slits, so the steward could spy on the pie making. A single slip of wrong spice or a dropped spoon could lead to a whipping, or worse. Despite it all, banquets remained lavish. To show weakness by refusing food was risky. To host a sparse meal looked cheap, so kings dined with a smile even when their guts churned with fear. They toasted with trembling hands and made jokes between bites. Because in the game of medieval dining, every course was a gamble, and sometimes the only thing worse than being poisoned was looking like you expected it. The throne room is silent, but not empty. You feel it, that tingle between your shoulder blades. You're being watched, not by peasants or enemies at the gate, but by the people closest to you. Your nobles, cousins with polished smiles and hidden knives. Welcome to the true battlefield, your own court. Forget the cliché of angry mobs storming the palace gates. In medieval Europe, the real danger to a king almost always came from within. The barons, dukes, and lords beneath you weren't meek subordinates. They were political predators, each with their own ambitions, private armies, and grudges going back generations. A misplaced word at dinner could be the spark that lit a rebellion, or, worse, a family feud. Many monarchs found themselves surrounded not by allies, but by relatives with suspiciously strong sword arms. Cousin revolts were so common, some royal genealogies read like crime thrillers. Take King Henry IV of Germany, who was kidnapped by his own nobles twice. They said it was for the good of the realm. He said it was treason. Scholars still debate who had the better argument. Power sharing was the medieval illusion. Kings relied on these nobles to maintain order across far-flung territories. In return, they had to grant titles, land, and favors, turning their own authority into bargaining chips. It was like trying to rule a kingdom by slowly giving pieces of it away. Every court had its whisper networks. Servants, clerics, foreign envoys, all listening, all talking. You couldn't yawn without someone wondering if it was a political statement. And if you dared punish a noble for stepping out of line, expect retribution. Often subtle, occasionally bloody. One lesser-known plot involved a banquet where a duke toasted the king with wine laced in laxatives not to kill, but to humiliate. The king spent 3 days recovering. The duke spent 3 months being very careful. Nothing was proven. Everything was remembered. Symbols mattered too. Seating arrangements at court could spark duels. Who stood closest to the throne, who carried the royal sword during ceremonies, protocol was politics in disguise. Violating it was like flipping the bird in chainmail. Historians remain divided on how much power medieval kings truly had. Some paint them as master manipulators, playing their nobles like chess pieces. Others see them as barely hanging on figureheads with fancy titles, kept in check by a handful of powerful families. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between ceremony and sabotage. What's certain is that the crown didn't come with a loyalty guarantee. Your nobles swore oaths of fealty, and broke them when it suited. Alliances shifted like weather. A former friend might back you today, and siege your castle tomorrow, citing divine will family honor or a slightly better inheritance deal. So, as you sit upon the throne, flanked by smiling barons and whispering courtiers, remember this. The people who bow deepest are often the ones holding a dagger behind their back, and they won't strike until you're most certain they won't. The parchment trembles in your hands, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the numbers scrawled across it. Tally marks for debts, totals owed to mercenaries, a list of jewelry quietly pawned to foreign bankers. You are a king, yes, but one who is perpetually broke. Medieval monarchs were rarely flush with coin. Ruling required cash to build castles fund. Crusades pay knights, host feasts, bribe bishops, and occasionally buy peace. Yet the crown's income depended on a delicate dance of taxes, tithes, and tolls, each resented, negotiated, or outright ignored by those meant to pay them. You'd think owning a kingdom meant owning everything in it. But in practice, most land was in the hands of nobles or the church. Royal forests leased to hunters. City markets controlled by guilds. Even bridge tolls had to be approved by councils of merchants. The king's purse jingled, but only after long rounds of pleading. Petitions for funds became a regular royal performance. Kings called assemblies, parliaments, estates, general diets where they stood before squabbling lords and burghers, hat metaphorically in hand. In return for approving a new tax, these groups often demanded concessions, land grants, legal exemptions, or political favors. Some monarchs gave away so much in exchange for tax revenue they undermined their own power. One chronicler tells of a French king who borrowed heavily to fund a military campaign, then returned to find his royal seal had been pawned by his treasurer. It took months to retrieve it, and longer to restore trust. Surviving records disagree on whether this was fraud, desperation, or both. But they agree on one thing: the treasury was always empty when it mattered most. Creative solutions abounded. Some kings sold off titles wannabe a count. That'll be 10,000 florins. Others devalued the currency, mixing base metals into coins and hoping no one noticed. Spoiler, they noticed. Riots followed. In one German city, angry citizens filled a chest with slugs and dead rats, sending it to the king as payment in kind. Then there were the royal jewels. When funds ran dry, monarchs often pawned or sold their personal treasures to bankers, especially those in Italian city-states. A crown might sit in a Florentine vault for decades before being bought back or replaced with a cheaper replica. Paintings still show kings in glittering regalia, even if the originals were being used as collateral in Venice. Some scholars argue that this constant state of royal poverty kept medieval monarchs in check, too broke to be truly tyrannical. Others suggest it made them more dangerous, forcing risky wars and aggressive policies just to refill the coffers. What's certain is that a medieval king's day began, not with statecraft, but spreadsheets, well scrolls, and a grim question how to pay for the crown today. Because in a world where armies marched for silver and loyalty could be bought by the pound, being king didn't mean being rich. It meant being the guy everyone asked for money, who had none to give. You bolt the chamber door behind you, heart thudding. Outside, the coughs echo louder than footsteps. The air carries the sharp sting of vinegar-soaked rags. Someone whispers a prayer in Latin. You may be king, but the plague doesn't care. It's at your gates now. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century, it swept through cities and castles alike. Royalty weren't spared. If anything, their high mobility and frequent audiences made them even more vulnerable. A visiting envoy could bring gifts or fleas. A bishop's blessing might carry more than absolution. Kings scramble for protection. Some fled their capitals entirely, retreating to remote hunting lodges or fortified manors. Court physicians recommended elaborate quarantines, wrapping doors in tar-soaked cloth, burning herbs banning strangers from court. A few rulers ordered daily inspections of servants' armpits. It didn't help much. One monarch reportedly wrote his will 5 times in a single week, each version more frantic than the last. Another sent an edict declaring the plague a punishment for sin and promptly caught it himself. Surviving records offer conflicting accounts of which kings died from the plague and which simply vanished from view, never to reappear publicly. In chaotic times, silence was a form of death. You might think royal physicians had answers. They didn't. Theories abounded: bad air, planetary misalignment, foul humors, divine wrath, but none led to a cure. Treatments included crushed emeralds, bloodletting, and sweet-smelling poultices. Some kings rubbed crushed rose petals on their skin. Others bathed in vinegar. A few even wore live toads around their necks, hoping they'd absorb the sickness. There is no scholarly consensus on how effective royal precautions were. Some rulers did survive outbreaks, leading later generations to believe their methods worked. Others likely avoided death through sheer isolation or luck. One thing is clear: fear shaped royal policy. Entire courts moved overnight. Audiences were canceled for weeks. Even coinage changed as fewer officials handled treasury seals. In one case, a king ordered a feast in defiance of the plague, inviting nobles to dine in a hall surrounded by bonfires meant to purify the air. The gesture was bold, theatrical, and tragically fatal. A third of the guests never returned to court. The king, meanwhile, spent the next fortnight locked in a tower, eating alone and reportedly muttering prayers through the keyhole. Plague also complicated royal succession. When heirs died, suddenly dynasties wobbled. Council meetings became frantic with backup plans drawn and redrawn in the margins of already outdated scrolls. Entire governments operated like emergency rooms, triage rumor, and hopeful improvisation. Some scholars believe the plague more than war or rebellion permanently reshaped medieval monarchy. It thinned courts, created new power vacuums, and shifted public perceptions. If a king could sicken and die like anyone else, was he truly divine? For a ruler accustomed to control the plague was the ultimate insult, a reminder that even in your most gilded chamber, you were just one cough away from history's forgettable footnotes. You shift beneath the weight, not of politics or war this time, but of gold, literally. The crown on your head presses down like a headache forged in metal. Regal, sure, comfortable, not in the slightest. Medieval crowns weren't just symbols of power. They were wearable statements of prestige, lineage, and occasionally poor judgment. Some weighed upwards of 7 pounds, their surfaces studded with gems the size of walnuts. When perched atop a weary monarch for hours during coronations or state ceremonies, they turned heads mostly downward from exhaustion. Imagine standing in a stone cathedral, incense curling through the air, bells echoing across the rafters, while trying not to faint under a jewel-encrusted hat. That happened more than once. One king collapsed mid-oath. Another forgot his lines, entirely mumbling vows while sweat dripped into his eyes. A third reportedly tripped on his own robe and lost a shoe, his slipper now immortalized in a tapestry. Though the artist tactfully excluded the tumble. Why so heavy, partly for symbolism? A massive crown suggested massive authority. More gold, more power, or so the theory went. Some scholars argue that the sheer size and weight were deliberate design choices meant to overawe the nobility and clergy. Others suggest it was vanity monarchs competing in an unspoken arms race of headwear. Art historians still debate whether crown designs were more aesthetic or strategic. Certain crowns featured pointed arches, perhaps nodding to divine favor. Others included ancient relics, splinters of saints' bones, bits of the true cross, adding spiritual weight to the already considerable physical burden. There's no scholarly agreement on whether these sacred additions were meant for blessings or just prestige points. Outside the coronation chamber, though, kings rarely wore their official crowns. Most kept them locked away in treasury vaults, brought out only for special occasions. Day-to-day crowns were lighter affairs, velvet caps, circlets, or nothing at all. After all, it's hard to chase rebels or sign scrolls when your head feels like an anvil. Yet, even when unworn, the crown loomed large. Its image was stamped on coins, woven into banners, and painted into royal portraits. And in those portraits, the crown was often exaggerated, wider, brighter, impossibly symmetrical. It didn't matter if the real crown pinched your ears and gave you a neck cramp. On canvas, it made you look invincible. Not every monarch loved the weighty tradition. One French ruler reportedly asked for a lighter crown, sparking murmurs among his advisors about weakness. Another commissioned an alternate coronation headpiece, smaller silver, and less prone to causing migraines. It was never used. The ceremonial council deemed it inadequate for royal majesty. And so, the heavy crowns remained, symbols of burden as much as authority. Because in the medieval world, ruling wasn't just a mental weight. It was physical. Metal dug into scalp. Pressure pulsed behind the eyes. And all the while, you had to smile like your temples weren't screaming beneath your golden halo. Being king, it looked glorious on parchment, but on the neck, brutal. The banquet hall is filled with music, flickering candles, and the nervous glances of diplomats. You sit at the head of the table, dressed in silks dyed deep crimson. Beside you, barely tall enough to reach the roasted swan, is your new bride. She's 12. And this isn't a wedding. It's a transaction. Marriage in medieval royalty wasn't about love. It was about borders crops, alliances, and heirs. Kings married for grain rights, for river access, for dowries filled with dubious coin. Sometimes they married to stop a war. Other times, the marriage started one. The bride's age, a technicality. The groom's affections, irrelevant. What mattered was lineage and what it could be traded for. One monarch, still a teenager himself, was wed to a noblewoman twice his age because her family owned the only pass through the Alps not controlled by enemies. The wedding feast lasted 2 days. The awkward silences lasted much longer. Chroniclers politely note the couple maintained separate quarters for some time. It wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. Political marriages brought foreign influence into court. A queen with cousins abroad might pull strings for her family. Jealous courtiers whispered. Factions formed. Some kings found themselves sleeping beside not just a partner, but a spy. And then there were the poison attempts. One lesser-known queen allegedly tried to assassinate her royal husband twice. Once by lacing his evening wine with belladonna, and again by slipping crushed glass into his pears. He survived both. She claimed illness and retired to a convent. Some scholars suspect she was framed. Others argue she simply had enough of being a diplomatic pawn. There is no consensus on which royal marriages were truly affectionate. Some couples did grow fond of each other over time, bonding over shared ruled children or mutual disdain for the nobility. Others barely spoke, communicating through messengers despite sharing a castle. The line between alliance and imprisonment was thin and rarely crossed. Marriage contracts read like legal treaties. Dowries could include cities, ports, entire provinces. In one case, a princess came with a gift of 50 falcons and a barrel of ambergris. The groom's reply, a pledge to supply her family with annual shipments of wax salt and occasionally knights. Divorce, unthinkable. Annulment was possible but rare, and usually required papal approval and a very creative excuse. One king claimed his queen was secretly a nun. Another insisted she had been bewitched into marrying him. In both cases, the church frowned and then collected a handsome processing fee. Some historians believe these loveless unions weakened monarchies, creating fragile alliances held together by shared misery. Others argue they were pragmatic, reducing conflict and stabilizing claims. But even the most diplomatic scholars admit medieval royal marriages were more like mergers than relationships. So when you picture a king walking hand in hand with his queen bathed in candlelight, remember those hands were probably sweaty from anxiety, and the candles lit less for romance than to ward off poison. Because in the chessboard of kingship, love was rarely more than a pawn. You kneel on cold stone crown, set aside bare feet, trembling against frost. Before you stands a bishop eyes unblinking beneath his mitre. You're the king, and yet tonight you beg forgiveness like a common sinner. Because in medieval Europe, even royalty bent the knee to the church. Religion wasn't just a pillar of medieval life, it was the entire scaffolding. Every royal decision from declaring war to marrying a cousin required divine blessing, and that blessing came not from the heavens directly, but from the men who claimed to speak for them. Popes, bishops, abbots, they could make or break a reign. Kings were anointed by the church, their authority supposedly granted by God. But that didn't stop clergy from reminding them who had the real hotline to heaven. If you cross the church, expect to be excommunicated, cut off from sacraments, refused burial, declared spiritually dead. For a king, this wasn't just embarrassing, it was politically fatal. One monarch excommunicated for taxing church lands had to walk barefoot through snow to the Pope's residence and wait 3 days outside the gates before being granted absolution. Some historians argue it was a calculated act of penance. Others suggest it was pure desperation. Either way, he caught pneumonia and the church caught a reputation boost. Confessions were regular royal duties. Kings admitted sins to bishops sometimes publicly, with priests scribbling down every detail. These were often read aloud during Mass, partly to demonstrate piety, partly to shame. Imagine sharing your worst decisions with a room full of chanting monks and a few nosy scribes. Church feuds could turn royal palaces into theological war zones. If a king appointed the wrong bishop or refused a papal decree, the result might be an interdict shutting down religious services across the entire kingdom. Weddings, baptisms, even funerals were banned. The people turned restless. Nobles grew uneasy. And suddenly the king wasn't just unpopular, he was unholy. Some monarchs leaned into it, styling themselves as semi-divine. Others buckled, giving away land treasure or political favors to buy ecclesiastical peace. One ruler reportedly built a cathedral from scratch just to appease a local abbot who had accused him of moral decay. The king never attended Mass there, but the abbot got new windows. Historians continue to debate whether the church held more power than the crown. In some regions, bishops were wealthier than kings. In others, kings appointed bishops like chess pieces, stacking their councils with family and allies. The balance shifted constantly, often depending on who had the louder choir or better scribes. There were bright spots. Some kings found genuine comfort in religion. They prayed, fasted, even joined monasteries later in life. One abdicated entirely, retreating to a cloister and spending his days copying scripture by candlelight. He reportedly said it was the first time he truly ruled himself. But for most, religion was a daily negotiation between power and penance, between throne and altar. And for every public display of devotion, there were whispered arguments behind cathedral doors. Because in the end, even kings had to confess. The hall is quiet save for the scratch of your pen. You're drafting yet another document this time, not a treaty or tax decree, but your son's future, or trying to. He's currently throwing a jeweled goblet at a servant in the courtyard. Being king is hard. Knowing who will replace you, harder. Medieval heirs were wild cards, brilliant, volatile, occasionally missing. Royal blood didn't guarantee royal aptitude. One day your child was learning Latin from a Benedictine monk. The next, they were jousting drunk in the stable yard. And as the years passed, the question gnawed at you: when I'm gone, what chaos will follow? Succession wasn't always automatic. While primogeniture, firstborn inheritance became common over time, politics often complicated things. If your heir was a toddler, a woman, or simply unpopular, expect rival claims. Siblings, cousins, even in-laws might step in, claiming the divine right to rule better. One kingdom changed rulers 5 times in a decade, all technically legitimate. And heirs were fragile. Disease, duels, hunting accidents. They vanished quickly. A crown prince could die from an infected tooth. A princess might fall from a horse. One royal heir slipped on monastery stairs and cracked his skull. The monks swore it was an accident. Some scholars still aren't sure. The emotional toll was brutal. Kings mourned publicly, but politics didn't pause for grief. One monarch famously buried his son on a Tuesday and held court again on Wednesday, naming a new heir before the dirt had settled. Chroniclers called it heartless. Others saw it as necessary. Either way, the court moved on. Then came the regents. If your heir was too young, someone had to rule in their name, often a mother, uncle, or ambitious noble. These regencies were dangerous. Power clings. Few wanted to give it back. One regent ruled for 12 years even after the heir came of age, declaring him spiritually unready. The heir eventually declared war. Even when heirs survived to adulthood, the results weren't always reassuring. Some were intellectuals with no battlefield experience. Others were warriors with no sense of diplomacy. A few were, to be honest, complete disappointments. One prince bankrupted the treasury, building a mechanical orchestra that never worked. Another tried to ban vegetables for being too earthy. Historians debate whether these wild cards weakened monarchies or merely reflected them. Some argue that a strong council could balance a weak heir. Others insist that instability at the top spread downward, triggering rebellions and wars. The truth likely depended on timing and how many swords your heir could buy. In rare cases, monarchs bypassed their own children, entirely naming nephews or even distant relatives as successors. This sparked fury, of course, and often bloodshed. But it wasn't always wrong. One such replacement, considered a long shot, ended up reigning for 50 peaceful years. Another lasted 5 months before being mysteriously poisoned during a chess game. So, when the torch passed from father to child, it wasn't always with pride. Sometimes it was with a sigh, a whispered prayer, and a very detailed backup plan. Because in the medieval world, nothing kept a king up at night, quite like his heir. You lie in bed, if you can call it that. More straw than mattress, more stone than comfort. A torch sputters in the corridor, casting long shadows across your chamber walls. Somewhere boots shuffle, a guard coughs. Another hour passes and still sleep avoids you, just like everyone else. Royal sleep in the Middle Ages was a contradiction. Kings ruled vast lands, commanded armies, commissioned cathedrals, and yet couldn't get a decent night's rest. Castles, for all their grandeur, weren't designed with comfort in mind. Thick walls held in cold, windows let in wind, fireplaces smoked, and the beds, four-poster, yes, but the curtains were less for coziness and more to keep rats out. Forget peace and quiet. Guards rotated every few hours, often with clanking armor and whispered updates. Courtiers crept through halls at all hours, delivering late scrolls or messages from distant provinces. And if that weren't enough, church bells rang throughout the night, vespers matins, compline each calling monks to prayer, and each echoing through stone like divine insomnia. Kings often shared their sleeping quarters, not with queens, but with trusted companions, bodyguards, or advisors. Privacy was rare. You might have your own chamber, but it could still be entered by 4 different doorways, each leading to another anxious servant. And you never really slept alone, not when assassin spies or disgruntled relatives might pay a midnight visit. There were rituals, of course. Sleep was treated like a royal event. Foot baths, psalm readings, talismans tucked beneath pillows. Some monarchs burned incense or carried sleep stones, smooth pebbles thought to calm the mind. One king reportedly slept with a Bible on his chest to ward off nightmares. Another hired a professional dream reader to interpret his nightly visions. Most of them involved falling. One lesser-known ruler insisted on being sung to sleep by 2 choirs, one stationed inside the other, outside his chamber window. The result, predictably, was discordant. After 3 nights of no sleep, he ordered silence. Chroniclers note that he never tried the experiment again. Some scholars argue that medieval sleep was polyphasic, broken into segments. Kings might nap early, wake for a few hours to write or pace, then sleep again before dawn. Others insist that royal insomnia was stress-induced. Running a kingdom, after all, doesn't lend itself to restful dreams. There's no scholarly agreement on which theory explains it best. The royal bedchamber itself was a blend of status and superstition. Carvings of saints or mythical beasts decorated the posts. Sheets were changed infrequently. Mice were frequent visitors. One monarch even commissioned an enchanted mattress stuffed with herbs and horsehair believed to block curses. It did nothing for his back. Even the act of sleeping was politicized. Napping during court meetings was seen as weakness. Sleeping in late signaled laziness. And yet, a well-rested king was a rare and envied thing. Most ruled on caffeine's medieval cousin, spiced wine, and pure exhaustion. So, if you picture a king drifting off to harp music in a warm bed, think again. More often he tossed, turned, and woke up just in time to pretend he hadn't slept at all. The door closes, but you're not alone. Behind the tapestry, someone shifts. A servant lingers a moment too long. The page glances at your scroll before handing it over. In the medieval court, privacy isn't just a luxury, it's a myth. Even as king, your life is observed, recorded, whispered about. Every move carries meaning. Every silence invites speculation. From dawn to dusk, and long after, there's always someone watching. You eat, dress, even pray beneath a veil of scrutiny, wrapped not in velvet, but in constant awareness of being witnessed. Royal apartments were not private sanctuaries. Chambers were divided by curtains, not walls. Servants bustled through day and night, tending fires, delivering messages, adjusting drapery. A king's private study often had 3 exits, each connected to different halls. And while guards protected you from assassins, they also heard everything: sighs, arguments, secrets. Letters rarely private. Scribes copied them. Messengers memorized them. Foreign ambassadors intercepted them. Seals could be faked. Wax could be softened and resealed. Even love notes to queens were sometimes dictated aloud, because not every king could write. Your declarations of affection might pass through 5 hands before reaching hers, and 2 of them belonged to your enemies. Spying was a professional art. Nobles kept informants at court. Bishops had ears in confessionals. Monasteries copied royal edicts and passed gossip with the same ink. Some monarchs employed their own network of shadowy listeners, palace cooks, stable boys, and falconers who reported not just on enemy movements, but on noble side-eyes at feasts. One king became so paranoid, he ordered new wall hangings every month to check for hidden holes. Another had a servant who recorded who smiled at him and who didn't. A third banned talking in hallways, fearing echoes would carry secrets. Some scholars argue these rulers were unstable. Others suggest they simply understood the court too well. There's no scholarly consensus on how much privacy kings truly lost, but the evidence points to near total exposure. Ceremonial waking routines were performed before dozens of onlookers. Even the royal bedchamber wasn't off limits. Queen consorts sometimes gave birth in front of an audience, proof that heirs were legitimate. Your life belonged to the realm. One particularly absurd example: the toilet servant. In some courts, an official usually titled the groom of the stool managed the king's bathroom visits. He tracked digestion, maintained linen, and noted the ruler's general health. It was a position of both intimacy and influence. Some grooms later became powerful advisors. Because if you knew when a king was cranky, you knew when not to ask for money. Even your image was curated. Portrait painters included symbols to suggest privacy: curtains, open windows, unread books, but they were fantasy. You didn't read alone. You didn't dine alone. And if you ever whispered to yourself in a corridor, odds were someone noted it on parchment. Because in medieval monarchy, nothing stayed behind closed doors. There were no closed doors, only one slightly ajar with ears just beyond. The painting hangs in your great hall, looming regal and just a little dishonest. You look taller. Your hairline's been restored. The gout swelling in your left foot magically vanished. Your royal portrait doesn't just flatter, it outright lies. In the medieval world, portraiture wasn't a mirror. It was propaganda. Most kings were never painted from life. Instead, artists worked from descriptions, sketches, and royal demands. Make the nose straighter, they were told. Add a few more muscles. No, even more. The result was a curated illusion, a monarch not as he was, but as he wished to be remembered. Artistic flattery was part of the job. Royal patrons paid handsomely and often dangerously. Displease the king with too much realism, and your studio might end up repurposed as a dungeon. So, artists painted power chins, jutted forward eyes locked on the divine horizon, shoulders impossibly broad beneath gleaming armor. The fact that some kings were half blind, hunched, or missing teeth, quietly omitted. One infamous ruler demanded that his portraits show him wielding a sword despite never lifting one in battle. Another insisted his horse be painted rearing, even though he was terrified of riding. Historians still debate whether this was insecurity or simple theatrics. What's certain is that these portraits set the tone for how future generations would remember them. There's scholarly disagreement over how accurate medieval royal art ever tried to be. Some suggest early court painters were more interested in symbolism than realism. A scarred king might be depicted with glowing skin to suggest divine favor. A widow might appear alongside her long-dead husband in a family portrait to reinforce dynastic claims. Time itself was bendable in oil and egg tempera, and it wasn't just faces that were fictionalized. Clothing backgrounds and accessories were all loaded with meaning. A royal robe might be painted brighter than it truly was to suggest wealth. A book clutched in hand might never have been read, but implied wisdom. In one peculiar case, a ruler's favorite hunting dog was painted into every scene despite having died years earlier. Portraits also traveled. Diplomats carried painted miniatures to prospective brides, foreign courts, and rebellious provinces. These weren't just art, they were portable myths. A young queen might agree to a marriage based on a picture showing a prince with golden curls and noble cheekbones. The real version. Well, the marriage was already signed. Of course, not all kings approved of the practice. One ruler famously destroyed a painting that made him look too youthful, fearing it would undermine his authority. Another requested that all court artists depict him older, sterner, more like a patriarch than a playboy. He wanted to be remembered as granite, not velvet. Some modern scholars still analyze these portraits pixel by pixel, hoping to glimpse the real monarch beneath the myth. But in truth, the mask was part of the job. Because if you ruled by perception as much as policy, then every brushstroke mattered, and your legacy depended not on truth, but on how well it was painted. You lie in state draped in velvet and surrounded by incense. Choirs chant. Courtiers weep, some sincerely, some by habit. You are dead. Or so they say. Because in medieval monarchy, even death is complicated, and final, not always. The moment a king died, the machinery of succession clanked into motion. Bells tolled, messengers galloped, crowns were whisked from heads to heirs in a choreography so rehearsed it seemed almost casual. But behind the ceremony, chaos lurked. Power vacuums opened, factions stirred, and beneath the gilded casket, things weren't always as restful as they appeared. Funerals were grand affairs meant to project stability. The body might lie in state for days surrounded by symbolic regalia. Mourners passed through chambers strewn with herbs to mask the odor. Wax effigies often stood in for the real corpse during processions just in case decomposition got ahead of the schedule. But burial didn't always mean peace. Kings were buried in cathedrals, abbeys, mausoleums, and sometimes places far stranger. One monarch was laid to rest in a tomb carved into a cliff face reachable only by ladder. Another was buried beneath the floor of a monastery he had once taxed heavily, reportedly as penance, or revenge. Some monarchs didn't stay buried. Tombs were reopened either to retrieve relics, verify identities, or just settle rumors. One king's grave was exhumed 3 times over 2 centuries each time to check that it was really him. Scholars remain divided on whether this was driven by curiosity politics or sheer medieval nosiness. In one infamous case, a monarch's body was dismembered, after death head buried in one city heart, in another, entrails somewhere else. Each location claimed a piece of royal sanctity. Pilgrims followed, coins were minted, power echoed from the grave. It wasn't decomposition, it was distribution. And then there were the fakes. Rumors often swirled that a king had faked his death, disguised as a monk, fled to the east, returned as a ghost. One pretender claimed to be the resurrected son of a dead monarch and gathered enough support to spark a civil war. Surviving records disagree on whether he was truly royal or just remarkably confident. Even the imagery of death was theatrical. Paintings showed kings ascending to heaven, guided by angels, or resting peacefully with hands folded. Reality rushed, embalming misfired cannons at the burial and dogs interrupting the ceremony. One funeral procession had to pause when the cartwheel broke, sending the coffin tumbling into a ditch. The clergy kept chanting anyway. Historians argue over how much medieval kings controlled their legacies from beyond the grave. Some left tale burial instructions, including tomb design, procession music, and posthumous titles. Others died mid-campaign with no plans at all, their bodies hauled home in barrels of wine for preservation. Dignity, like loyalty, was negotiable. And so, your crown passes on. Your tomb is sealed, but your story, still being rewritten by monks, nobles, artists, and bored scribes with ink to spill. Because in medieval monarchy, death didn't end the drama, it just changed the venue. But even while alive, a monarch's most private moments could become sites of unexpected power, because nothing in court life, especially not bodily routines, escaped the gaze of hierarchy. You enter the royal privy chamber, and the air is complicated, not awful exactly. There are herbs in the corner, a faint hint of lavender in the rushes, but unmistakably human. The groom of the stool is already there, quill behind one ear, silk gloves on, and a stack of folded cloths laid out beside a small cabinet of rosewater. He's not a butler, not exactly a valet, certainly not a doctor. But somehow in this intimate, undignified moment, he holds more sway than most dukes. To attend the monarch in the most vulnerable of bodily routines required absolute trust. And in return, the king offered whispers, complaints, hopes, fears, policy. The groom recorded bowel movements, yes, but also took notes on court intrigue. Letters were handed off, appointments arranged, and in time the position shifted from menial to mighty. By the late 1500s, the groom of the stool was often a nobleman himself, elevated not just for loyalty, but for discretion. Historians point to figures like Sir Henry Norris and Sir Anthony Denny, men who effectively controlled royal access through the bathroom door. One recorded list of his tools included linen squares, perfumed water, and an arse-wiping stick, which, as sleep-friendly as we try to be, cannot be ignored. These were no mere janitorial items. They were the symbols of proximity, of intimacy. To handle the royal body was to handle its power. And here's the twist in a court obsessed with formality and hierarchy. This lowly-sounding job gave a man the one thing no title or estate could offer: unfiltered time with the sovereign. There are even rumors, unconfirmed of course, that some grooms quietly reshaped royal decisions during these daily visits. Some scholars argue this role was the true heart of personal monarchy, the raw center of sovereign human connection. Others remain skeptical, suggesting the influence of the groom was exaggerated by later writers eager to inject scandal into history. Either way, one thing is clear. If you wanted to reach the king, you didn't go through a throne room. You waited outside the bathroom. From the privy to the pantry, your next stop takes a sharper sniff. Because if royal power had a scent, it probably came with a hint of overcooked lamb and faint panic. The poison taster stands silently by the fire eyes darting across every tureen, every simmering pot. He's not just hungry, he's suspicious. His spoon dips into a thick broth, his lips barely touch the edge, and everyone watches. The queen waits, the cook sweats. Even in palaces built of marble and myths, meals were never safe. Not entirely. Across the centuries, kings and emperors, whether Roman Mughal or Bourbon, feared their food more than their foes. And so, they hired guardians of the gut men, and sometimes women, tasked with dying, first should the roast be treacherous. The role varied by court. In some places, tasters were slaves. In others, they were nobles bound by duty stomach ache and ceremonial fork. You might also meet a food snarfer, a kind of pre-taster who only sniffed the dishes. One account describes a man who merely inhaled a bowl of porridge before nodding it through to the monarch. Another source, hotly debated, claims a tester once dropped dead after licking the king's jam. Strawberry, in case you're wondering. There was science to it, sort of. Medieval test methods included silver spoons believed to blacken when poisoned onions rubbed on meat, and the dubious ritual of feeding a sample to a dog first. Not exactly laboratory conditions. Still, many tasters survived their careers intact. Others? Well, records are spotty. Poisonings were rare, but the fear was constant. What did a taster actually look for? Numbness in the tongue, bitter aftertastes, unusual textures, and of course vomiting, lots of vomiting. Tasters often carried emetics and antidotes trained not just to eat, but to survive. In one German court, the official tester's contract included a bonus clause if he lived past 30. Some scholars suggest the role was more theatrical than protective part of a ritual to assure guests that everything was safe. But there's no denying the anxiety embedded in royal cuisine. Every course was a gamble, every goblet a question mark. There's even debate about whether some kings wanted to be poisoned, if only to escape court boredom. A late medieval French diary records one sovereign sighing. At least a sip of death would make supper memorable. Was it sarcasm, despair, a tragicomic commentary on stuffed quail? You slip into the shadows of the kitchen, past the roasting spits and the glint of copper pans. The food smells rich cloves, grease-fresh bread, but it carries tension too. A strange blend of comfort and caution. And at the center stands the poison taster, calm, pale, and always one bite ahead of everyone else. It's hard to feel powerful when your job is to carry someone else's sword, especially when that someone is too royal to lift it themselves. But here you are, small, noble-born, and exactly 12 years old, assigned to the court as a page. No armor, no battles, just fetching cloaks and polishing hilts. The corridors echo with footsteps larger than yours. Knights' advisors and courtiers all sweep past while you hover behind clutching a blade half your size. And yet, for all the lowliness of the task, everyone watches what you do. Because the page learns everything. In royal courts from England to Castile, pages were sons of aristocrats, not quite servants, not quite guests. They served nobles or monarchs, directly handling their clothes, running errands, and learning court etiquette with an intensity that rivaled military drills. A dropped glove could earn you a month of stables. A misplaced sword might mean exile. Still, pages weren't just background furniture. They saw everything. Marriage negotiations whispered in hallways. Letters passed in secret. One wrong glance and you knew too much. Or, if you played it right, just enough. Historically, the role was seen as a kind of apprenticeship. A page might become a squire, then a knight, and someday, if ambition matched luck, even a lord. But not all of them made it that far. Some remained invisible. Others disappeared entirely, swallowed by gossip, exile, or scandal. There's a strange little anecdote from a 14th century court where a page reportedly tried on his master's cloak during a banquet and impersonated him for hours, fooling no one but entertaining everyone. The record ends with he was sent home to his mother, which may be the gentlest court punishment on record. Scholars debate how much influence pages actually wielded. Some argue they were mere errand boys, low in rank and easily replaceable. Others point out that their proximity to power combined with noble lineage made them quietly indispensable. After all, who better to carry secrets than someone too young to be taken seriously? You kneel beside your lord's chair sword across your lap, pretending not to hear the argument unraveling behind you. You study posture tone the way a duke hesitates before speaking. You memorize names, connections, and the twitch of a noble's hand when lying. And when summoned, you stand quickly silent, steady, and sharper than the weapon you carry. It's strange how much you absorb in silence. No grand speeches, no armor clanging, just years of watching until one day someone hands you your own sword and trusts you not to drop it. The embroidery frame is tilted just so, catching the candlelight. Threads of saffron and teal twist through delicate linen. But it's not just roses and falcons being stitched here. It's messages, carefully coded, quietly traded between glances, between breaths. You're among the ladies in waiting now. Dressed in velvet, perfumed with orange water, and surrounded by layers of ritual, they look like background characters in a court painting. But lean a little closer, and you'll hear the real kingdom unfolding not in the throne room, but in the whisper behind a fan. To be a lady in waiting was to balance every social rule on the blade of a needle. Chosen from noble families, these women attended queens, princesses, and sometimes rival consorts. They weren't just pretty companions. They were confidants, go-betweens, matchmakers, and sometimes secret negotiators. Marriage alliances, inheritance claims, and foreign treaties passed through their hands like skeins of silk. One 16th century Venetian ambassador remarked that nothing of state is settled without the queen's maids knowing it first. And he wasn't being poetic. Not every lady in waiting stayed loyal to her mistress. There were plots, affairs, even betrayals. But more often there was patience. A lady might wait 10 years before her moment arrived. One overheard plan, one lucky confession, and suddenly she was shaping policy behind closed doors. There's an odd little tale from the Polish court, where a lady in waiting supposedly delayed a royal wedding for 3 months by pretending she'd lost the bride's favorite slippers. Historians disagree on whether it was sabotage or sheer forgetfulness. Either way, the wedding was never rescheduled. Ladies also served as informal spies. A lace cuff might conceal a note. A bouquet might contain crushed herbs to signal danger. The line between gift and message was paper thin. Of course, some ladies in waiting became lovers. Others were accused of it whether they were or not. Romantic intrigue was practically a job hazard, especially in courts where privacy was a myth and jealousy a blood sport. Surviving letters often reveal coded phrases like "the night blossom opened" or "the candle burned twice," suggesting nocturnal rendezvous with very complicated implications. There's still scholarly disagreement about how much power these women truly held. Some argue they were manipulated pawns, their influence exaggerated by novels and gossip. Others insist they were essential cogs in the machine, operating beneath, behind, and occasionally in front of the queen herself. You sit beside them now, pretending to admire the embroidery. The thread moves, but so do the eyes. A glance to the door, a blink that means wait, a twitch of the wrist signaling not now. And then a sudden stillness. The moment passes. The court continues. But something just shifted quietly, irrevocably, and only 3 people in the room even noticed. The falcon blinks at you with one amber eye, tilts its head, and lets out a shriek so sharp it slices the morning fog. You freeze not from fear exactly, but because it's not clear whether you've just been insulted or warned. The royal falconer chuckles softly beside you, slipping a gloved hand beneath the bird's feet, like it's a house cat, instead of a predator with talons sharp enough to flay a roast. Caring for a king's hawk isn't some quaint hobby. It's a full-time job, and not one for the faint of heart or arm. Falconers had to balance discipline, affection, and deeply inconvenient bird moods, often while dressed in stiff brocade and under the scrutiny of the court. The birds had names like Sir Screech Lady Whistle or Murdering Joy, which was either ironic or painfully accurate depending on the season. These weren't pets. They were royal status symbols, tools of diplomacy, and sometimes war. When a king gifted a falcon to a rival monarch, it was like handing over a diplomatic bouquet laced with mild violence. Daily duties included feeding them raw meat, never cooked, don't even ask, cleaning their perches, inspecting feathers for parasites, and managing their tempers. One 13th century manual advises whispering to the bird during molting season, lest it feel neglected and rebel. And rebel they did. There's record of a falcon who escaped during a royal hunt and shredded a duchess's hairstyle beyond repair. You follow the falconer down a quiet corridor toward the mews, past iron hooks, wooden stands, and little shelves of lures, bells, and hoods. The air smells of leather and feathers like a dusty saddlebag full of secrets. In the mews, rows of birds perch in silence, some asleep, some glaring, some meditating on whether to defecate in your direction. Falconers weren't minor servants. In many courts they ranked just below knights and were paid handsomely for their trouble. In a few rare cases they could even dine at the high table, though never during a meal involving partridge. That would have been considered cruel ironic or just awkward. Some scholars argue falconry was more about image than utility. After all, it took hours to prepare the bird, release it, and wait for it to return with or without its quarry. But to the court, the spectacle was the point. It wasn't just hunting. It was performance, control, majesty distilled into feathers and silence. There's ongoing debate about whether falconers trained more than just birds. Some historians suggest they subtly trained the court itself, teaching patience, restraint, and the art of watching before acting. You stand now at the edge of a field, the falcon perched high above on the king's wrist. It looks around, calculating the wind, the prey, the politics. With a small nod, the falconer lifts a finger. The bird launches into the sky, slicing upward like a thrown crown. And for a few seconds, even the king looks a little envious. The candle gutters, the ink dries, and the only sound is the faint scratch of quill on parchment. You're in the scribe's chamber now, technically a study, but more honestly, a paper graveyard. Scrolls spill from cubbies, parchments curl along the floor, and a single inkwell guards the desk like a moat of permanent stains. The royal scribe doesn't sleep, or at least not in the same way others do. He dozes with one eye open, twitching at dreams of misspelled proclamations. His fingers are calloused, his spine bent, and his sense of humor dry as the ink he stirs each morning. You wouldn't guess it from the quiet, but this was a powerful role. More than a copyist, the scribe handled the voice of the crown. Every edict, every treaty, every birthday message to a moody cousin passed through this room. And every one of them had to be perfect. The pressure was immense. One misplaced comma could redirect an army. One smudged name might insult an entire duchy. There's a delightful 15th century record of a scribe who accidentally titled a bishop most unstable servant of God. The king laughed. The bishop didn't. The scribe was reassigned to grain inventories for 5 years. Still, scribes wielded quiet influence. Many historians believe they polished royal speeches, softened dangerous rhetoric, or added subtle digs at rivals. One scroll from the Castilian court includes the phrase "as wise as our neighboring monarch," which scholars argue was either sincere or savage depending on the scribe's mood. Not all scribes were anonymous drones. Some became trusted advisors, confidants even. The act of writing brought them close to state secrets. A royal journal, penned by a tutor scribe, contains side margin notes like, "The king is cross today," and "Avoid Lady Weston, she is shouting again." The tools of the trade were humble, but precise, sharpened quills pumice to smooth the vellum sand for blotting. Mistakes couldn't be deleted, only scraped away or covered with red ink. Red ink was ominous. It meant someone somewhere had changed their mind. Again. Debate still circles around how much scribes altered official records. Did they embellish victories, edit defeats? Some say they were loyal stenographers. Others think they were quiet propagandists reshaping history with every careful line. What is certain is that without them, the royal voice would have been hoarse, chaotic, and misspelled. You pause beside the scribe now. He hasn't looked up in hours. His candle has burned into a tiny pool. His margins are tight. His posture tragic. But when he sighs, it's not frustration, it's rhythm. This is how the kingdom breathes. And as he signs the final line with a flourish and blots the parchment with sand, he mutters, not for the first time, "May the king not read this too closely." The fool's cap jingles slightly as he leans against a marble pillar, arms crossed, face unreadable. He's watching the court, not performing. Not yet. The jest comes later. For now he observes. That's what makes him dangerous. In a room filled with flattery, the fool was the one person allowed to speak freely. Sort of. Every joke was a gamble, every laugh a tightrope. One chuckle too many, and you were brilliant. One misstep, and you were gone. Court fools, also called jesters, natural fools, or licensed clowns existed across cultures. Medieval Europe favored the colorful motley and cap with bells, but Persia had its own brand of court humor, sharp and dry. In China, jesters once critiqued emperors through poetry. No matter the empire, someone had to say what everyone else was thinking, without getting executed. Some fools were chosen for their wit, others for their perceived eccentricity. There's an old record of a jester named Pease, whose jokes were so bad that nobles started repeating them out of politeness, unsure whether he was serious or deeply ironic. One court document simply notes, Pease continued his routine. The king looked tired, but the best fools knew timing. They waited for silences, they pricked pomposity. One French jester reportedly saved his life by mocking the queen's cousin and suggesting a new tax policy in the same sentence. It's unclear which part amused the king more. Their role wasn't just comic relief. Fools carried news-delivered satire, and on rare occasions intervened. There's a story debated among scholars of a jester in the Danish court who physically blocked a sword fight with a lute. The fight ended. The lute did not survive. In England, the fool Will Somers served Henry VIII for decades, joking even as the king's moods grew darker. Letters mention Somers comforting the king when no one else dared approach. That kind of access was rare and potentially dangerous. If the sovereign laughed, you lived. If not, well, court records don't always include obituaries. You wander now through the hall as the jester begins to pace, muttering to himself in rhyme. Courtiers pretend not to listen, but their ears tilt slightly. He juggles 3 apples, then drops one exaggeratedly. Look, he says even the fruit is falling from favor. A few snickers, one choked gasp. The king doesn't blink. Some historians argue that fools were unofficial advisors cloaking wisdom in absurdity. Others suggest they were kept precisely to distract, to entertain, to absorb tension like comedic sponges. The truth, as ever, probably lies somewhere in between. Because when no one else dares speak, the fool steps forward, bright clothes, sharp tongue, and a truth wrapped in nonsense. And whether the king laughs is history's coin toss. The torch flares as you lift it, wax dripping dangerously close to your knuckles. It's heavy, warm, and slightly smoky, more club than candle. Your job to carry it, all night. Through stone corridors where shadows move faster than people. You are a royal torchbearer, and your fingers are already blistering. Before electricity and gaslight palaces needed mobile illumination, chandeliers were expensive and stationary, candles flickered and died. So, every corridor, every banquet, every nighttime ceremony required a human torch, someone to hold, monitor, and replenish the light. It sounds simple until you realize it means hours of standing, walking, and waving your arm, just enough to keep the soot from your face. Torchbearers were usually lower servants, but essential. Their presence determined whether the queen could see her soup, whether the duke avoided stepping on a dog, and whether the king's midnight stroll didn't end in a lawsuit. You were invisible until the flame went out. Historical manuals warned bearers never to raise the torch above eye level, lest the wax drip onto guests or into their own hair. But wax was unpredictable. Diaries mention servants with wax scars, burns along their forearms, and in one case hands so smooth of mark they bore no print. Essentially, no fingerprints left by 20. There's a curious story from the court of Louis XIV about a torchbearer who fainted mid-procession, causing the king to trip over his own shadow. The man was revived with wine, reassigned to stables, and lived out his days smelling like hay. Some torchbearers carried ceremonial status. During coronations or royal funerals, they became symbols of guidance and vigilance. Their torches weren't just practical, they were metaphors, flaming proof of royal continuity. Scholars still debate how literal these metaphors were, with some arguing that light was treated almost religiously in royal spaces. The job wasn't without perks. You gotta see things. Private things, lovers sneaking out of chambers, secret meetings in libraries. One 15th century torchbearer reportedly witnessed a duel in the wine cellar, lit the whole affair without blinking. Still the burden of light grew heavy. Arms trembled, clothes reeked of smoke. One servant wrote that he feared fire more than war. A sword may miss its mark. A torch never forgets your sleeve. You pass through the halls, now the flame above you, casting long shadows of tapestries and candelabra. Every few steps the wax hisses, your hands sting. You adjust your grip, blink away soot, and keep walking. Because someone has to light the way, and no one else is foolish enough to volunteer. And when the torch finally sputters and dies, you do what every torchbearer must, relight it from your own sleeve, if necessary. The steam rises in soft, ghostly curls from a copper tub, and someone is boiling the king's underwear again. You try not to stare, but really someone has to launder the royal braised cod pieces and doublets. And tonight, that someone is muttering over a bubbling pot of lavender and lye. Laundry in the royal household was not a gentle affair. It involved cauldrons paddles, heavy soap made from animal fat, and more superstition than science. A stain on the king's sleeve wasn't just embarrassing, it was a court scandal, a tear in his underclothes, political sabotage. Royal laundry masters were trusted specialists, often working deep in the servant wings of the palace. Their days began before sunrise, hauling water, sorting linens, and soaking clothes in mysterious herbal mixtures believed to chase away illness, bad luck, or jealousy. In some courts, they even whispered spells while scrubbing just in case. The process was painstaking. Undergarments were boiled, not washed, boiled over an open fire. Afterward, they were scrubbed on rough boards, rinsed in cold water, wrung by hand, and pinned on ropes that stretched across courtyards like medieval prayer flags. And then came the ironing. Royal irons were flat heavy and heated directly on coals. Too hot and they scorched silk. Too cold and the wrinkles remained. One laundry account from the Portuguese court records a tailor being fined for insufficient smoothing, which sounds like a euphemism, but sadly isn't. A single shift, what we'd call an undershirt, could take hours to clean properly. And how many did the king own sources vary? Some say 7-1 for each day. Others claim dozens, all meticulously embroidered. There's still no scholarly consensus, though. One historian suggests a Wednesday shirt survives in a Belgian museum. Of course, stains were inevitable. Wine grease, candle wax, and worse. Remedies included vinegar chalk, stale bread, and crushed beans. One laundry mistress swore by pigeon droppings, though her results were inconclusive. These weren't nameless drudges. Many laundry masters had their own quarters, their own assistants, and even their own hierarchies. The mistress of the robes outranked the keeper of the suds, who in turn directed the boiler of linens. If that sounds made up, consider this royal wardrobes were worth more than some villages. Some scholars argue the laundry chamber was a site of secret power. Clean linens, after all, meant dignity. Fresh garments could signal health wealth or readiness for diplomacy. Others believed the job was seen as beneath notice, a thankless task buried in soap and steam. Either way, laundry kept the image alive. You wander now among the drying racks, ducking to avoid damp hose and regal underpants flapping gently in the breeze. A laundry maid passes you a folded chemise, still warm from the iron, and nods with weary pride. Because while others may have wielded swords or quills, she holds the starch. And some days, that's more powerful. A trumpet blares not musically, but urgently, like someone trying to wake a goat with sound alone. You wince. The herald steps forward in robes far too bold for his voice and unrolls a scroll longer than his arm. He clears his throat and with theatrical flourish begins to shout, "Your business, not your personal business unless you're royalty. But if you're a king, queen, or noble with a promotion, betrothal declaration, or new baby elephant, the herald is here to announce it, loudly, sometimes poetically. Sometimes with the unfortunate flair of a man who once took one acting class and never recovered. In the days before social media, and by that we mean town criers, church bells, and gossipy candle makers, the herald was the kingdom's walking news feed. They delivered royal edicts, summoned nobles to war, and in some cases insulted foreign leaders on behalf of their monarchs. With style, heralds were trained. They studied genealogy, coats of arms, battlefield protocol, and vocal projection. Their robes signified authority embroidered with royal colors and symbols. You could ignore the local baker. You could even ignore the local priest. But you did not ignore the man with the trumpet. One famous English herald named Clarencieux was known to yell with such intensity that pigeons fell from rooftops. Another in Burgundy mispronounced a visiting noble's name so badly it sparked a minor feud. The records dryly note, the Duke did not find it amusing. At tournaments and coronations, heralds took center stage announcing combatants, listing titles, and making sure everyone knew exactly how impressive everyone else was. It wasn't just noise, it was branding. There's debate about how accurate heralds were. Some scholars argue they exaggerated victories, flattered patrons, or forgot inconvenient facts. Others insist they were professional recorders, their scrolls more consistent than royal diaries. One late medieval document describes them as the memory of the crown, etched in voice. Of course there were mistakes. One poor fellow announced a wedding that had been secretly canceled. Another accidentally declared the queen's name as her duckness, a moment still cited in court letters with unkind glee. The herald was fined 5 groats and reassigned to monastery announcements. Beyond proclamations, heralds were also early diplomats. They carried messages between feuding nobles, arranged truces, and sometimes negotiated ransom terms. The rules of war often protected them. Killing a herald was a diplomatic disaster, like stabbing a singing telegram. You follow one now through a crowded square, his boots loud on the cobblestones, his voice louder still. He holds his scroll with pride, bellows with conviction, and somewhere beneath the noise believes deeply in the truth of what he says, even if he just called someone Earl of the Spatula. The stable smells like hay sweat, and something nobler than manure may be ambition. You hear hooves shifting harnesses, jingling, and over it all the voice of the man in charge, the master of the horse. He's not yelling, he doesn't need to. Horses listen, and so do courtiers. Don't let the title fool you. This wasn't just about oats and saddle soap. The master of the horse managed royal processions, cavalry logistics, breeding stables, hunting expeditions, and more ceremonial entrances than a theater troupe. If the king rode it, paraded with it, or fell off it, it was his problem, and his power was considerable. One incorrect saddle height could offend a visiting duke. One missing stirrup could derail a treaty. There's a record from the Austrian court of a horse master who delayed an entire diplomatic convoy because the ceremonial mule had flatulence. Some scholars suspect sabotage. At royal weddings, it was his job to coordinate the horses that pulled carriages down to the ribbon, color at their bridles. During battles, he oversaw mounts for knights' messengers and escape routes. His team managed feed grooming, hoof care, and illness, and occasionally he got to name things. One 17th century horse was dubbed, spite another ambassador's regret. Being master of the horse required elegance and authority. He had to speak with kings and stable boys alike to know both bloodlines and bridles. The king's favorite mount was often more temperamental than the king himself, and if a hunt went poorly, someone had to take the blame. Usually the horse, sometimes the master. There's ongoing academic debate about whether this position leaned more ceremonial or strategic. Some say the master was a glorified equestrian event planner. Others point to letters revealing how military campaigns hinged on his judgment of terrain distance and how long a destrier could run without collapsing. And then there's the matter of theft. Horses were borrowed sometimes permanently, especially after long royal hunts, when nobles suddenly misplaced the king's more beautiful animals. An inventory from the court of Charles VI lists 14 horses unaccounted for, likely in the possession of Lord B, who claims they followed him home. Despite the drama, this was a position of trust. The master often rode beside the king during hunt ceremonies and travels. He whispered advice over reins-judged moods by hoofbeats, and was one of the few people allowed to raise his voice at royalty if a horse reared too close to danger. You watch him now, adjusting a girth strap, inspecting a horse's flank, with the eye of someone who's seen war's weddings and whispered court betrayals all from the back of a moving beast. The horse snorts, the master nods, and somewhere far away a royal decree waits, delayed until the ceremonial mule cooperates. The bedchamber is too quiet, the curtains too thick, and the king is 8 years old and furious about pudding. You hover at the doorway, uncertain whether to bring in the tutor or the nightshirt. Welcome to the life of the royal chamberlain part, butler part, diplomat part, babysitter, with excellent posture. When monarchs were children, and often even when they weren't chamberlains, managed everything that happened behind bedroom doors. They weren't just folding linens or adjusting pillows. They soothed tantrums, scheduled lessons, administered medicine, and occasionally, though unofficially, told bedtime stories. The position had prestige. A chamberlain was closer to the king than any minister, priest, or advisor. He oversaw personal staff, monitored access to the royal body, and ensured that no one slipped poison into the hot chocolate. One letter from a Polish court mentions a chamberlain who refused to serve boiled eggs for a month after a suspicious guest complimented them too enthusiastically. But when the monarch was young or acted like it, the job turned intimate, strange, and sometimes absurd. There are accounts of chamberlains darning socks at midnight, refereeing toy disputes, and recording dreams recited at sunrise. One French chamberlain reportedly resigned after being bitten 3 times during one sleepless week. The records simply note, he returned to his orchard. No further contact. Sometimes they had to manage puberty. That meant mood swings, awkward questions, and the occasional panicked wardrobe incident. In many courts, they were also responsible for emotional support. The king cries, "You dry the tears." The queen pouts, "You fetch her bird." The prince gets a splinter. You summon 5 surgeons and a priest. Scholars debate how much actual governance chamberlains performed. Some believe they had no real power, merely acted as glorified nannies. Others argue that their influence was profound, shaping the future ruler's habits, fears, and worldview before the crown even touched their head. And the bedroom was never just a bedroom. It was where alliances were made, secrets spilled, and tempers exploded. Chamberlains kept the calendar of private audiences, decided who got 5 minutes of royal ear, and when necessary, made excuses for kings who simply didn't want to come to dinner. You spot a worn book on the side table, a short history of majestic slumber. A half-eaten honey tart rests nearby, sticky with crumbs. A single slipper has been flung under the canopy. The chamberlain sighs, picks it up, and places it beside its twin just so. And when the young king throws a pillow in protest of bedtime, the chamberlain catches it mid-air without flinching bows and replies, "Your Majesty's battle tactics are as always impeccable." Down in the vaults past the kitchens and below the wine cellars sits a man with a ledger. He's not glamorous. He doesn't sparkle at banquets or duel in courtyards. But he knows exactly how many jeweled goblets the queen owns, how many salted eels remain in storage, and who borrowed the silver soup ladle last Tuesday. This is the royal clerk, the kingdom's quiet accountant. From ivory thrones to wax candles, the clerk recorded it all. Every object, transaction, and edible item passed through his pages. His world was numbers ink, and the occasional eyebrow raise when someone ordered 14 velvet cushions for meditation. Clerks weren't just bean counters. They were the unseen backbone of the court, organizing supplies, tracking expenses, and flagging suspicious overorders. If 5 barrels of wine vanished, it was the clerk who knew. If the stable suddenly requested 12 extra saddles for training, it was the clerk who asked why the horses were taking night classes. Their ledgers, bound in calfskin or linen, were often more reliable than royal chronicles. Unlike flattering courtiers or forgetful monarchs, the clerk's records had no incentive to lie. In fact, some of the most detailed historical data about royal households comes not from paintings or letters, but from grocery lists. There's a charming and slightly alarming entry from a 16th century English clerk that reads Tuesday 3rd, lambs roasted. Wednesday 2, deer 1 goose, 17 custards. Thursday stomach complaint. Whether he meant the king's or his own is unclear. Clerks had to be fastidious. Mistakes in math could mean overspending, underpaying, or diplomatic embarrassment when the Spanish ambassador's dinner included only 4 kinds of pheasant. Some used abacuses, others tallied with notch sticks. A few wrote in shorthand so cryptic that modern historians still puzzle over whether HRY7BN meant Henry V's bannocks or a personal vendetta against baked goods. Some scholars argue that clerks wielded subtle power, deciding what to include or omit, what to flag, what to delay. Others say they were mere instruments trapped by bureaucracy and ink stains. Still, their attention to detail preserved the very rhythm of royal life. You step into his chamber now. It's dim, paper-scented, and suspiciously quiet. Shelves groan under the weight of parchment rolls. A cat sleeps on a stack of invoices. And the clerk, hunched over his desk, dips his quill, mutters something about too many figs, and scribbles a note that could outlast an empire. Because long after the kings are gone and the feasts are forgotten, someone will read these ledgers and know what really happened. The basin is silver, the water warm, and the king's feet slightly ticklish. You try not to react as he chuckles, twitching at the gentle scrub. Welcome to one of the most peculiar jobs in royal service, the washer of royal feet. This wasn't a daily chore, it was ritual, symbolic, ceremonial. Usually performed during Holy Week or Easter, the foot washing was meant to demonstrate humility. Monarchs imitating Christ, they said. A moment of service, a bow to the divine. Except, of course, it wasn't the king doing the washing. That task fell to someone far less divine and far more nervous. The washer, typically a servant trained in both discretion and ankles prepared meticulously. The water was often perfumed, towels embroidered, basins polished until they reflected more than just toes. In some courts, rose petals were added. In others, a special oil was used to anoint the feet before drying them with linen cloths woven for that single purpose. Royal feet were not ordinary feet. They had political meaning. To touch them was to enter sacred space. And yet some washings were less about holiness and more about theater. In one English account, a particularly solemn ritual was interrupted when the Queen giggled after being splashed. The servant in question was reportedly retrained in subtlety. These ceremonies varied by region. In Spain, foot washing included the distribution of alms and bread. In France, it often involved reading scripture aloud while kneeling. And in the Holy Roman Empire, emperors were known to wash the feet of 12 poor men, but only after their servants had pre-washed them, a kind of ritual pre-rinse. Historians still debate how sincere these acts were. Some argue the ritual helped humanize the monarch even briefly. Others call it hollow pageantry humility, with an audience. Surviving records show a mix. Some rulers seemed genuinely moved. Others used it as a PR event with better lighting than most coronations. And there are odd details, too. A 15th century account from a Polish court mentions that the king insisted on tickling the servant's foot back as a gesture of reversed grace. Whether this was recorded with amusement or horror remains a point of scholarly dispute. You kneel now, cloth in hand, as the ritual begins. The room is hushed, candles flicker. Courtiers stand back, unsure whether to look away or pretend deep reverence. The king places one foot, then the other, into the bowl. You pour gently, avoiding splashes. You dry carefully, knowing the towel will be preserved. Everything must feel meaningful, clean, rehearsed. But as the second foot lifts, the king shifts, leans down slightly and whispers, "It tickles, but don't stop." And suddenly centuries of theology feel just a little damp around the edges. The tunnel curves, the torches fade, and the stone grows cold beneath your feet. You're deep now, past the feasting halls and echoing staircases into the realm of stillness. The gravedigger waits with a lantern, his shovel slung casually over one shoulder. He does not speak right away. Down here, words are measured like steps. In royal service, no one had a job quite like his. He was the last to see the king. The last to touch the crown, even if only to place it atop a velvet pillow. The last to close the lid. The royal gravedigger didn't just dig. He prepared the body, dressed it, kept vigil over it. Then, when the time came, he buried it quietly, precisely, and usually alone. Gravediggers in royal households were paradoxical figures, invisible while alive, unforgettable when death arrived. Their work combined ceremony and secrecy. Coffins had to be sealed with wax rites performed, relics placed, and in some cases traps set, yes, traps. Tomb robbing was real, even in sacred spaces. One 14th century record refers to counterfeit monks caught chipping at a crypt wall, and treasure rumors abounded, jewels buried with the monarch, scrolls, cursed rings. One account from the Hungarian court insists that a royal toe was missing when the tomb was opened a century later. Whether it was theft decay or an overzealous embalmer is still debated. Gravediggers sometimes knew too much, secrets heard during final preparations, signs of illness wounds, or even poisons that the official record omitted. The burial chamber became a final confessional, and the gravedigger reluctantly its silent priest. Most tombs were constructed long before they were needed, carved with marble reliefs and Latin inscriptions no one could fully translate. Yet, when the moment came, it was always a rush. The crown cracked, the linen too short, the embalming herbs stale, and so the gravedigger adjusted. They always adjusted. There's a soft tale from the Scottish court of a gravedigger who slipped a poem into the folds of the queen's sleeve before sealing the tomb. No one found it until 300 years later, preserved in dry velvet. The verse read, "All things return, but love waits quietly." Some scholars argue gravediggers were merely laborers uninvolved in ritual. Others claim they were trusted keepers of royal legacy, their hands the final editors of history. The truth likely rests with the dust. You walk beside him now, down into the crypt. The walls are lined with effigies, stone kings with folded hands, queens with delicate crowns, all frozen in sleep. The gravedigger opens a small iron gate and gestures toward a fresh plot. The tools are ready. The silence is total. And just before he begins to dig, he glances up and murmurs, "Funny, isn't it? They all look taller once they're gone." As you return from royal chambers and echoing crypts, let the weight of candlelight and centuries ease from your shoulders. Tonight you've walked alongside jesters and scribes, watched hawks soar and torches flicker, and witnessed the quiet hands that shaped history from behind thrones and underfoot. Each servant odd, devoted, forgotten, reminds us that even the grandest palaces relied on burned fingers, tired ink, and midnight lullabies. Power may have worn a crown, but it also wore slippers someone else had to fetch. So, let your breath slow. Let the page turn softly closed.